Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So Bikram, of course, has written Colony of Shadows. He is from Bangalore. I think that would interest Bangalore audiences the most. He has completed an MA in creative writing from University of East Anglia and was awarded the Charles Wallace India Trust Writing Fellowship in 2016. And first, I think we will kick off with a little bit of reading from Colony of Shadows just to give a taste to everyone who hasn't read the book.
Uh, First of all, thank you to the BLF. Thank you to everyone who's over here. It's so lovely to see so many friendly faces. Um, I thought I'd read from an early chapter in the book. Varun walked through the grove behind the bungalow. He'd spent the past week counting the trees on the property and only recognized 3. At the end of the driveway was the massive banyan, hundreds of roots dangling from its branches and weaving into one another to form delicate curtains he could brush aside. By the side of the house was the guava tree. Even though Jyoti auntie had warned them to be careful, he'd still scraped his elbows climbing its trunk. And the guava he plucked was so hard he couldn't even bite into it. Poppy had sniffed the guava without interest, then chased after a squirrel and barked as it scurried across branches. The third and final tree was the most special, a bougainvillea in bloom by the boundary wall, Ma's favorite. Sometimes they would go for a walk in the colony's park, and she would point at trees and ask him to guess their names. Bougainvillea had been the easiest to learn because of how difficult it was to spell. Who knew a word could hide so many letters? Ma had laughed the first time he guessed at its spelling. The smell of wet earth was rich this deep inside the grove, with its muddy puddles and leaves turning to mulch. It reminded him of rain on stone, of Ma's hands after gardening. It was winter in Delhi. His school sometimes closed for days because of the pollution, and he and Komal liked to sit in front of the television and watch cartoons all day long, warming their feet against the portable heater. Outside, a dense fog would hang low among the tree branches, coating the roofs of parked cars with moisture. In Bangalore, the air was light, bright, and not even that cold. Peering through the gaps in the canopy, he could see kites flying in graceful circles, their wings spread wide and their bodies dipping with the wind. How did they do that? He would have to look this up when he got home. Then he remembered. Home was packed into suitcases and cardboard boxes. He didn't even know if they'd brought Ma's nature books or Pa's gigantic leatherback volumes of Indian history. What about the gramophone? The back of his throat prickled. He kicked at a tree trunk. The sight of its scraped bark immediately made him whisper an apology. No, the boxes in his room only contained his old belongings, not theirs. Maybe there were other boxes hidden away, but Jyoti auntie was so keen to unpack and shelve and tidy up that he would have noticed. There was always something she wanted him to do. He pinched himself. It wasn't fair to think cruel thoughts about her. Ma had told him that Jyoti auntie faced difficulties he could never understand. He picked up a stick and, keeping his eyes shut, tapped the ground and moved forward with an arm outstretched. He tripped over a root. He splashed into a puddle and soaked one of his shoes. His socks squelched with every step. He tripped over another root and stumbled headfirst into a wall. Here he was, struggling to walk a few feet. Meanwhile, Jyoti auntie could cross roads without hesitation. He removed his shoe and squeezed the water from his sock. The wall he'd walked into was the boundary wall, and from the other side came the incredibly loud sounds of construction. There were great booms and hoarse calls. He wasn't sure what was happening out there, but clouds of dust drifted over the wall and settled on the leaves and branches of the grove. Following the boundary wall, he caught sight of the bougainvillea and tried to recall what Ma had told him. The vines have long, spiky thorns, so be careful. The flowers are actually white, but they're surrounded by a cluster of pink leaves called bracts. What else? Above him, shards of glass from broken bottles had been wedged into the cement at the top of the boundary wall. What else had Ma told him? How could he have forgotten so much? The last time they went for a walk in the park, he ditched her for a game of 7 stones without even saying goodbye. He remembered Pa plucking bougainvillea near Firoz Shah's tomb and threading it through her hair, and the jar in the living room, which she liked to fill with small pebbles and delicate pink bracts, and the time when she bandaged his fingers after he pricked himself on their thorns and was surprised into tears. But he couldn't remember anything else Ma had told him about bougainvillea. He rested his forehead against the wall. Its surface was grainy, browned over the years, with plenty of cracks and chips. It looked like it could collapse from the slightest of touches. He half wished it would. Voice tight in his throat, he whispered, "I want to go home." The wall gently shook with the pounding of construction. The movement disturbed a lizard from its hiding place. Varun watched it skitter across the wall. It was pale green and so translucent that he could see veins branching beneath its skin. Pa was terrified of lizards. The way they move, yikes! Why are they so unpredictable, man? He would flee from the room, while Ma, laughing, would nudge the lizard into a cup to set it free in the colony's park. "Hello, little ghost," Varun said, just as Ma used to say. He offered his open palm to the lizard, but it disappeared down a hole in the wall. Kneeling to get a better look, he was surprised to find the hole was large enough that he could squeeze through. On the other side were a filthy courtyard and an empty swimming pool. Varun frowned. He'd expected to see blue tarpaulin sheets and bamboo scaffolding, piles of sand and cement mixers, not an empty swimming pool. Where were the construction workers? Everything was carpeted in a thick layer of dust. Filthy and drained of water, the swimming pool looked strange, like it didn't belong there, and yet there was something familiar about it. He thumbed the edges of the hole, the wall's insides with its mossy bricks that were powdery yet rough to the touch. If he wanted to, he could cross over. He could have a quick look around and be back on this side without anyone knowing. He could. There was no one to stop him. Grandma hardly left her bed, and Jyoti Auntie never stepped inside the grove. Even if Jyoti Auntie did wander past this spot, it wouldn't matter because she couldn't see. His neck burnt with shame. No, that was not nice. He shouldn't have thought that. Picking at a scab on his elbow, he considered going back to the house to finish his homework, maybe help Jyoti Auntie unpack the remaining boxes. But then, he spotted something inside the pool. It was small, circular, casting a shiny speck of a reflection. A coin, waiting to be found. Varun glanced over his shoulder, then squeezed through to the other side. Seconds later, the hole in the wall sealed itself up. Thank you.
Thank you, Bikram, for that wonderful reading. Now, this seems to be a book about grief and, about deep emotion and a grieving child and all of that, but that's not exactly how you started writing it. So please do tell us what you had in mind when you started.
Well, when I first started writing this book, actually, I had been writing a book before this, which was a very serious literary book, the very kind of introspective. Unfortunately, it was very boring, and the characters were very lifeless, and the dialogue was very wooden. So I was feeling quite blue about that, and I was telling my parents about this, I was telling my wife about this, and they suggested, why don't you go write something fun? I took that to mean, why don't I go write something which I would be very excited to pick up and read? It sounds like a very obvious thing for a writer to do, write something that you would read. For some strange reason, I hadn't done that. And so I thought about the books I love. I really love Neil Gaiman's work, The Ocean at the End of the Lane. I really like Nilanjana Roy's The Wildings. A book which is, I've loved since childhood was Watership Down by Richard Adams. And essentially, thinking about those books, this image came to my mind because I did want to set it in Bangalore, of a boy who climbs through a hole and just discovers a very strange, abandoned city. That was the idea. I had no idea what the book was going to be about. I had no idea about the characters. That was the image. And I started with that. And after many, many drafts, finally arrived at this version.
All right. And so Varun, of course, is a very interesting character, this 9-year-old who's just lost his parents. But the other two characters, the book is, moved forward by three main characters, and they're all extremely interesting. So there's Jyoti auntie, who is blind, of course, and then there is his grandmother. So how did you, choose those characters, and how did those come to you?
Right. So it's not a spoiler to say there are actually four main characters in the book. One is Varun, who's the 9-year-old boy. His grandmother, whose name is Usha. His aunt, who's Jyoti auntie, as he calls her. And Poppy, who is a stray dog that's been adopted by Jyoti and Usha. And really, it was a case of with Varun, again, like I said, I'd started with this image of a child climbing through the hole in the wall. And I think as I came up with the eventual drafts, his character kind of developed organically. With Jyoti, I do travel to Delhi quite a bit, and when I was in Delhi, I was spending time in at my grandfather's old house, where my uncle lives. And I had, my uncle lost his vision in his 40s, and his interactions with my aunts, the way he spent his time, we would talk quite a bit, and he was very generous with his time answering my many questions about his frustrations and his ambitions and his desires. And he also took me to the National Association for the Blind. And essentially after one trip, the National Association for the Blind, the acting head at the time, Mr. Mukesh Sharma, he was very generous with his time, answered my many hundreds of questions, and he allowed me to sit in on one of their lessons. Essentially, after that trip, I think I kind of knew that I wanted to write a character, Jyoti, that was blind, but I wanted to, as a sighted person, I wanted to write her point of view with sensitivity, and in many ways kind of embodying a lot of the values that I saw in my uncle. So that was where Jyoti came from. And with Usha was a real struggle because many drafts, but I think I feel very lucky in that there were, for a few years, I was living in an apartment complex on Rest House Road near Blossoms and Bookworm, the dream. And when I was living over there, there was, in this apartment complex, there were, I called them, I hope this doesn't sound too mean, I would call them the Auntie Brigade, because they would gather by the gate and pronounce judgments on various things and ask us, they would grill us on various things about our life as well. And I think hearing them talk to one another, hearing them talk about the stray dogs, all of that kind of ended up feeding Usha as well.
I think the term Auntie Brigade also makes its way into the book at some point. One of the characters uses that. But I think the most interesting one definitely would be Poppy, the dog, because we have chapters from her point of view. And that's something new and interesting, and her perspective, of course, was wonderful. The way she's considering all of the family members, the way she calls Varun a pup. So I wonder how that came to you.
Essentially the same way with Usha. Living at that apartment complex, there were, outside of the apartment complex, 3 to 4 stray dogs. Sorry, I'll get this right. 5 stray dogs that we loved. And what we would do is every evening we would feed them, to the dismay of some people on the road. But yeah, we would spend a lot of time with them. And around this time was when I was writing an initial draft of the book. And I was so struck by how smart, how intelligent these dogs are, how much heart they have. They care for each other, but they're also extremely terrified of humans. They wouldn't allow anyone to touch them because obviously they'd been hurt, and you could see that they'd been hurt. And their intelligence, they knew when food was there. They would take refuge in the sewer the tunnels under the sidewalk, come out when they wanted to, and they were so friendly with each other. For me, it was another way of interpreting have fun and to try to write, again, with sensitivity from a dog's point of view. And essentially, I must admit, it was tremendous fun writing. If anyone who's an aspiring writer wants to have like a fun little project, try it. It's great fun.
Reminds me of the early essays we used to do as children. Autobiography of a chair or a dog. Um, but so Bangalore also, the city seeps into your work, even though it's very much located within the houses, and within the colony, within Varun's house in Bangalore and in Delhi, with both of the cities that you said you have a connection to, and those are sort of, nicely coming into the story.
Yeah. I think for me it was quite important to write about Bangalore because, in general, at least with my fiction, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Delhi, these have been sources of inspiration for me. And when it came to Bangalore, at least for this book, that image of a child climbing through a hole in a wall, it was similar to something which I had experienced in my own childhood, which was when I lived in an apartment complex. The neighboring property was a bungalow. It had, a driveway, and it had what I remember to be a grove. Memory is kind of tricky. Maybe now thinking about it, if I was to go back, maybe there were only like 2 or 3 trees, but how I remember it, it was a grove, and I used to go there all the time and just explore that property. And I think I wanted to capture the same thing for Varun. I wanted it to be this place that would, a child would be very interested in exploring. So that was at least one setting. The other important setting was, for me, was Delhi, a Munirka enclave, because I'd spent quite a few, again, in my childhood, I visited my grandfather, especially during winters, and I have quite vivid memories of those winters there, talking to my grandfather, talking to my Uncle Jogi, and essentially having fun, feeling quite cold, looking at the fog outside, sticking my feet against portable heaters, yes, all of that stuff. But these were very powerful places for me, which I did want to write about.
So I find it very interesting that you said you started with something that was fun and light, and a lot of ways, you've gone through with that, with the dog's perspective, with the way you're writing Varun, with the way it's about like a portal, the sort of thing that he's entering. And yet the book ends up becoming, about like a deeper emotion, about grief, about family, about sort of the connections and the intermingling and the dynamics within that. So did that surprise you while you were writing it and these themes began to emerge?
Right, yeah. So when I wrote the first draft, I did read it and go, oh, it's quite heavy on grief. And, what I had wanted to write was, I wanted to write a book which I would read almost in one sitting because it was so compulsive. And after finishing it, the characters would live with me, stay with me for a long time. That was my goal. And so in subsequent drafts, I really, really wanted the characters to shine. And to do that, I think it was a case of looking at family dynamics and making sure that the story wasn't weighed down with grief. That yes, that was a source, that was one theme to the entire book, but there were many other themes. And I found it was actually quite a joy to, I think a lot of writers talk about this, when the characters start to form themselves and then start to do things that are unpredictable. And it was really, really a joy when that happened in subsequent drafts for me, from my first draft. In particular, Jyoti and Usha and the things they started to do and their dynamics. I found that kind of, I'm saying it, I found that, hopefully readers will find it, but I found it lifted it and it made it, it did kind of make it more propulsive.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think when I was reading it, even though, the themes are definitely, deep and about grief and about like you're sympathizing with this young child who seems, feels very lost in the world, but the story still manages to be light and you still sort of continue and you're balancing both those things. I thought admirably well, and I really enjoyed that.
I will take the compliment, thank you.
All right, so, but then you also said there are lots of multiple drafts that you went through. So I just sort of want to glean into your writing process. Did you write a draft? Were you unhappy with it? Was it, you sought feedback and then you revised it? Or were you just, yeah?
Right, yeah. So I think there are a lot of writers who have a plan for a book and they plan it out very deliberately, knowing almost every component of it, and then write it. And I really admire them for that, because I have a very messy process by which I just pick up a notebook and I start writing. And I mean, in my first draft, it was a huge mess. If anyone was to find the first draft, I'd be mortified, really. It was a case of, I firmly believe writing is rewriting. You write your first draft, and it can be an absolute mess. But then from there, you can take it forward. You can say, right, these characters are working, this part of the story is working, and you build from there. My wife is very bored of this metaphor that I use, but I liken the first draft process to taking 4 planks of wood, nailing them together, and then filling it with sand. And that's like your playground now. That's the first draft. You have the playhouse. You can then start crafting sand castles. You can topple them over if they're not working, build them up again, finesse them, and then you have your sandcastle at the end. That's kind of how it is. So for me personally, this book is 8 drafts before I sent it to an agent, 10 drafts before I sent it to a publisher. So it took a while.
And are there any future first drafts that are in the works now? Or is the serious literary novel getting another go that was abandoned in favor of something fun?
I don't think I'll be returning to the serious one. That one was a little bit too serious. But I'd like to write another one. I have an idea for another one, and I'm just kind of working my way to sitting down and working on it, yeah.
All right, I'm looking forward to that. And also, I think you'd mentioned about, this sort of slippage of genres when you were writing this, and you were not sure that it fits into any particular one, and you were not sure about the reception of that, or, So how did that turn out?
Yeah, so I have struggled to say this book sits easily in one genre because it has, I believe it does things which are slightly different in comparison to, say, young adult fiction or to, say, very serious highbrow literary fiction. My hope is that, like I said, it would be it's a story which I wrote drawing on sources of inspiration, things which I found enjoyable. And the hope is that it will resonate with readers despite pulling together various different things. I wouldn't categorize it as experimental, but I hope that it is still unique. Yeah.
Would anybody like to ask some questions? A couple of questions from the audience?
Of the metaphor of the hole in the wall, that straight away pitches it into the literary fiction. So, so why, I mean, just because you had fun writing it, why do you say it's not literary fiction? Or
I'm not really sure why I have concerns about whether or not it falls into literary fiction. Maybe that is because sometimes a lot of the discourse around literary fiction tends to focus very specifically on realism. Now that can be countered by the current Booker Prize winner who has just gone completely in the other direction on that front. But I think that's perhaps a little flex on my part, just in terms of how sometimes literary fiction, sometimes magical realism, sometimes speculative fiction isn't almost always seen as mainstream literary fiction. Just perhaps my point of view on that.